benchmarks. Is everyone excited? Yeah, you are. So we have a group of people here in the room, and we have lots and lots of people on the internet. So we'll be speaking to both. So first of all, thank you for showing up here today and giving us an audience. Yeah, so we're so excited to share what we've been cooking up for you this year. Is there something you point? Do I need to do something? Oh, I'm on mute. Am I on mute? Okay, great. Let's just pause for a minute. It says unmute to start speaking over here.
You can go ahead, everybody can hear you. Like 30 people on the chat just said.
Right on. All right, well, let me start again. We are so excited to share with you what we've been cooking up the past couple of months. Benchmarks is a big deal. It's a big deal for all of us here at M&R. And I'm especially thrilled what we put together this time around. Of course, benchmarks is a chance for us to learn about all the big picture stuff and the context and data that all of us use every single day to drive our work. And we know you use it, and we take that really seriously. We really aim to deliver the kind of data that you can use in making decisions, in convincing leadership to help you make better decisions, and in just assessing how you're doing every single day. So we know that that's something you really use, and we're really proud to make it really useful for you. We know that's why you're here, but we hope that that's not all you're here for, because benchmarks for us is also a time when we really connect with each other. We connect all our data together and learn from each other. And we connect with the reasons that we're here and why we're doing this work. Every data point isn't just data. It's actually a person who is moved or inspired or enraged or driven to take action or to donate or to do something in the world around them. And I don't know about you, but that is pretty damn cool. So give yourselves a round of applause for being that data is all the people you've inspired. No, that's a shitty round of applause. Please give yourself a much better round of applause. Much better. Thank you. It's a really big deal. There's seats right up in front, and it would be cool if you sat in them so that they aren't blank in front of us. Thank you. I know you're not, but you don't have a name tag, but you should get a name tag at some point too. And of course, though, in addition to the heaping helping of data we deliver, we also wrap it all up in a theme. Have you figured out the theme? Have you? What's the theme? Yeah, food. This year's theme is food. And it's and not just because there's a million really delicious and delectable puns that go with food, which you will find out very soon if you have not already in looking at the book. But food is also, it's fun, but it's also a serious place. It's a place where nostalgia and justice come to meet. And you'll see that in our words, but you'll also see that in the art and in the design of our benchmarks book. Oh, hold on, I'm trying to scroll down. And you'll see it right here in this collage right here. Throughout the book and on the website, you'll see that every design decision here was a decision and really speaks to both the labor it takes to put food together, the excitement around food, the deliciousness around food. So you'll see every decision. And our art director, Melissa, who's not in this room, our art director, Melissa Hines, has commentary throughout the book and also on the website. So you'll see that as well as you go through. Okay, how do I advance? Oh, the clicker. It's not working. The clicker's not working. This feels wrong. Is it because of that? All right, now let's try it. Nope. There you go. Wait, so I have to do that? No, ignore all of us. All right, great. All right, so there's a lot of cooks in the kitchen this year. One of them is me. I'm Madeline Stanionis. I'm a partner here at M&R. This is my 11th benchmarks. And in case you were wondering, my favorite breakfast is not actually Swedish pancakes, it's chilaquiles, but Will Valverde, he'll be speaking later, it was his favorite breakfast and I didn't want to duplicate. But Swedish pancakes are also pretty delicious. If you don't know about M&R, we are a consulting firm. We believe in nonprofits and we only work with nonprofits. We believe that you are the important part of advancing justice, alleviating suffering, and solving a lot of the challenges that we face in this world. And I'm really glad you're here doing it, and I'm glad we get to do it with you. I'm pretty excited about everything that we do, but I'm particularly excited these days around two things. One is Scout Quest. If you don't know about Scout Quest, it is our data co-op. in which organizations share data that allow you to reach more people and do it without sacrificing the privacy of your donors and your activists. So we're pretty excited about that website there. I'm also pretty excited about M&R Win, which we just launched 2 weeks ago, which is a new part of M&R that's designed to actually figure out how we can work with nonprofits to build campaigns and electoral campaigns that actually freaking win. And we're really excited about that. You can find out more about M&R Win right there at that website as well. So we would not be here today without the 215 participants who are part of Benchmarks this year. Are you a participant? Raise your hand. And on the chat, out yourself in the chat. Wait, keep your hands raised. Right on. If you're not a participant, just say thank you to the people that have their hands raised, because it is a really great thing that everyone shares their data. So we have 215 participants this year in a lot of different sectors, and that's pretty exciting. Today is just a little bit of everything. So we're going to talk about the key findings, then we're going to dig in some of the major areas. Everything is available on the website. So please go, find it on the website. The second thing is we do have books here in the room. They, are precious because they use a lot of trees. So don't take two, take one for your organization, unless you really, really want to, because they're very beautiful and I understand. So please do that. And for folks here in the room, we're going to do question and answer at the end. For folks online, we're going to do question and answer as we go. So there are people here standing by, operators are standing by to answer your questions as we go. And without further ado.
Thanks, Madeline. Hi, everybody. I'm Will Valverde. I am a senior creative director here at M&R, and I'm the lead writer of Benchmarks. So it's my job to take all of the data that comes together, all of the insights from the really smart staff here, and try to turn it into something that is informative, that is useful, and hopefully that is fun as well. I'm going to walk through some of what I think are the most important and surprising findings from this year's study, and then we're going to dive into the real nitty-gritty details of each individual channel. Before we look at the charts, a couple of points to help you understand what it is you're looking at when you look at the charts. So first, we divide up our results by sector and by size. So by sector, we're talking about what is your issue area for your group. Participants in Benchmarks self-identify which sector they believe they belong in. On some of the charts, you'll see that one of the sectors or others drops off, and you'll no longer see what public media has on one of the charts. When that happens, it's because we didn't have enough data from that sector for that particular data point to give an average that we thought was reliable. We also divide up the participants by size. Size, for how we are describing it here for Benchmarks, for those nonprofits that have annual online revenue under 500K, we consider that small. Between $500,000 and $3 million in online revenue over the course of a year, that's a medium group, and more than $3 million is a large group. Whenever we talk about averages, which is a lot, we're talking about the median. So that means a figure where half of the participants fell below that number and half are higher than that number. We do that median instead of a mean average so that we can avoid having one or two outliers really sway the data. And then finally, when we talk about year-over-year change, growth or declines from year to year, we're talking about long-term data from this year's participants. We're not going back into Benchmarks from last year or 2 years ago. That's a different participant pool, so it wouldn't really be apples to apples. Now, the first big question we get every single year when we do Benchmarks is, did revenue go up or down? Just like that is sort of the headline number that people want to know most. The short answer is it went down. But we're never really satisfied with the short answer because a long answer tells us a lot more and it's a lot more interesting. So the top number here on the left, you're looking at overall the average decline in online revenue from 2021 to 2022. It's a 4% decline. A couple of things about that number. First, again, that's the median. So not every nonprofit saw a decline in revenue from the previous year. In fact, if you look down a couple of lines there, you'll see that disaster and international aid nonprofits reported an 8% increase in online revenue from the previous year. Fundraising for groups in that space tends to be really driven and really heavily influenced by what's going on in the world. So when there's a big major event, when there's a humanitarian crisis, you tend to see a big swing in response for disaster and international aid groups. So with the ongoing conflict in Ukraine dominating headlines over the course of 2022, as well as other events like the flooding in Pakistan, there was a lot of attention and a lot of revenue being driven to those groups. On the other hand, if you look a little bit lower, hunger and poverty nonprofits had the biggest drop. They dropped 14% from the previous year. And then if you look at the other chart on the right, that's the change from 2020 to 2021. So looking back one more year, and it's a 35% drop. Every other sector in that year reported an increase on average, except for hunger and poverty, where there's a 35% decline. 2 consecutive years of substantial declines by this sector. So what's that all about? It's about the pandemic. So what we're looking at now is actually going back to a 5-year view. And what we're seeing is each bar here represents 1 year's change from the previous year. If we look back at the change from 2019 to 2020, it's that blue bar that looks like it's breaking the whole slide because it doesn't really fit. That's hunger and nonprofits in the first year of the pandemic. And that's a 390% increase over what they were seeing before. The declines in these last 2 years are coming back down to earth a little bit from that peak. And it's showing that for nonprofits in that space, that retention is probably the biggest challenge that they have over this time period, is you have all these donors, keeping them engaged, keeping them interested, letting them know that their support still matters. And I think there's a lesson here for those nonprofits that did see growth last year, those international aid nonprofits that maybe saw a surge of new donors. You see those emergency response donors. Retention is going to be the big challenge. And we've got some slides about retention in a little while. So that's the big picture, sort of long-term view. It really helps us kind of understand what's going on in this current moment. It's also helpful sometimes to zoom way in. Here we're looking at just 2 days in the fundraising year. On the left here, we're looking at the change in revenue on Giving Tuesday alone. Overall, Giving Tuesday had 13% less revenue in 2022 than in 2021. Email revenue specifically was an 18% decline on average. These are pretty big drops, and Giving Tuesday is a pretty big deal for a lot of nonprofits. It's not the biggest deal. The biggest deal is on the right there. The biggest deal is December 31st. That's the biggest fundraising day for most nonprofits, and it looks really similar. It's a 13% drop in revenue from the previous December 31st in 2021, and email revenue was down by 22%. Some of what's going on here may just represent a spreading around of the revenue. Giving Tuesday isn't like a single day so much anymore. It was a few years ago. Now it's like a whole season. It's like a way of life. It's a whole vibe, Giving Tuesday. You've got early bird messaging. You've got match extensions that go along. So Giving Tuesday as a whole. So some of that might just be a spreading around. Our data is not refined enough to be able to pick up on that. There are some other factors. December 31st fell on a Saturday this last year. A lot of folks feel like that was not great. Going into a 3-day weekend is kind of a tough fundraising model. The bad news is this year it's going to be a Sunday, December 31st. But the good news is December 31st will not be on a Saturday again until the year 2033. So we've got some time to figure it out. There's other contexts as well. There was fears about inflation. There was fears about a possible recession. A lot might be going on here. I think the takeaway is if your nonprofit felt like it really struggled on Giving Tuesday or on December 31st, you should know that you're not alone. It was hard this year, and it was hard compared to the previous year. And these days are really important. Giving Tuesday accounted for 3% of the year's revenue for nonprofits online. December 31st accounted for another 5%. So altogether, that's 8% of the whole year's revenue on just those 2 days. And we're seeing these pretty stark declines. So when we look at that 4% year over year drop in revenue, some of that is being driven by these particular moments in time. All right, I'm going to shift away from fundraising a little bit. Look at what I think is one of the most interesting new metrics we have this year. This was something where when the data team first presented it, it just like turned on a light bulb for me about really like how we approach our work. So what we're looking at here is the ratio of ad acquired leads to start of year email size. Raise your hand if that's a metric you normally track. Yeah, oh, you do, nice. So this is kind of a weird one. I'm going to unpack it a little bit for you. So when we look at that top line number, 0.09 is the ratio of ad acquired leads to email list size at the start of the year. What that means is if you're a nonprofit, had an email list size of 100,000 names on January 1st, over the course of 2022, you would add 9,000 names through paid ads alone, 9,000 compared to that 100,000 starting place. If you started off the year with 1 million names, you would bring in 90,000 names on average through paid advertising. It's really hard to grow email lists. Growing an email list is a really important way to keep it thriving, to keep it alive. We need that influx of new subscribers to keep growing and keep that email program moving forward. So that 0.09 ratio matters, and that's just the median. So if you take a look at the colored bars on either side of that chart, the pink bar on the left goes down to the 25th percentile. The blue bar on the right goes up to the 75th percentile. So what that means, so overall, that accounts for 50% of all of our participants. That's basically what we consider the normal range. If you fall somewhere in there, you're being normal. Now look at that 75th percentile. Overall, it's above 0.3 compared per email list name at the start of the year. For the right sector, it's above 0.6. So that means that a nonprofit at the start of the year with 100,000 names, if you're in the right sector at that 75th percentile, you brought in 60,000 names over the course of the year through paid ads alone. For small nonprofits down there at the bottom, the 75th percentile, almost as many leads were acquired through ads over the course of 2022 as they had at the start of the year. So almost doubling the list size at that 75th percentile. So ads programs are really important to drive list growth for email, and list growth helps drive everything else that we're doing in email. The flip side of that is that email appeals can be the difference between a negative and a positive ROI for your ads program. Oftentimes it's getting that second gift, converting people to sustainers, keeping them engaged over time through your email program that is making those ads pay off over the long term. And we're going to get into what that looks like for ads in a little bit. There's this sort of mutual dependence between these two channels that goes beyond just aligning messaging that I thought was really, really exciting to see in the numbers this year. Now, this is the only pie chart that we are publishing in Benchmarks because our lead data analyst, Teresa, does not care for pie charts. She thinks they are misleading and terrible. So we normally stay away from them, but we're going to show this one. What we're looking at here is a little look at how peer-to-peer was working for our participants. So peer-to-peer text messaging, so where you're asking volunteers or staff members to engage in these one-on-one conversations. 41% of nonprofits that use peer-to-peer texting stuck with only their own opt-in list, while half targeted some combination of their own opt-in list for text messaging and some outside source of contacts. This is a quickly evolving space where carriers and government are still kind of figuring out what they're going to allow in terms of list sharing, in terms of the permissions and the opt-ins that you need. And so that might be changing over time. Now, those peer-to-peer messages were used for a variety of purposes. We see on the left here all the different things that they're for. The most common was fundraising. 62% of nonprofits that did peer-to-peer included at least one fundraising ask as part of that work. Advocacy and event attendance were the next most common uses. A bit of under half of nonprofits in our study who use peer-to-peer programs were using them for those purposes. Beyond peer-to-peer, nonprofits leveraged several channels for digital organizing. Almost all of them relied on email for organizing, with both peer-to-peer and broadcast SMS messaging for digital organizing at over 60% adoption. Those are what I thought were the most fun parts.
You're pretty fun, Will.
Yeah. Woo. I'm Jonathan Benton. I'm a senior vice president, and I work with our data team here. So helped kind of compile and overview all the data that went into the study. Will pulled out kind of the cross different areas, the main takeaways from the study, and I'm going to be digging into some of the juicier fundraising pieces. So over here, we're looking at the change in online revenue, comparing one-time giving and monthly giving, and you can see they're moving in two different directions. Overall, one-time giving was down 12% year over year, while monthly giving was up 11%. And when you break that out sector by sector, you'll see that nearly every sector had some sort of growth in monthly giving, with many seeing double-digit growth, while disaster and international aid and wildlife animal welfare were the two groups, the only two sectors that saw growth in one-time giving. As Will mentioned earlier, there was a lot of giving for Ukraine in 2022. We think that may tie into why wildlife animal welfare also saw a lift, because wildlife animal welfare also does emergency response, just like those international groups in some cases. Now, digging into the individual donor level, we looked at how many gifts per donor one-time donors were giving per year, and that was 1.2. So that kind of measures how well nonprofits were getting donors to give again within the same year, as compared to monthly donors who averaged 9.8 gifts. So that includes donors who may have started the year as a monthly donor, but also includes people who may have started their gift partway through the year, and groups donors that canceled their gifts during the year. That bubbles up to an average of $192 per one-time donor on average, and $287 per monthly donor. Looking at retention, one of the big kind of standout metrics for me this year was one-time donor retention. So that 29% we're looking at in 2022 is groups or individuals who made a one-time gift in 2021. What percentage of them made another one-time gift in 2022? That's up ever so slightly from 2021, but down significantly from 2020. So you'll see, just kind of make a note of big variation in one-time donor retention. The other thing that was notable about one-time donor retention across sectors is the difference between one-time retention of new donors versus prior donors. So new donors, people who made their first ever gift in 2021, only had a 16% retention in 2022, whereas prior donors who had made other gifts before, had 49% retention. Looking at monthly donors, it's a little bit of a different story because it's not just about if they make another gift, because almost all of them do. It's about how long they continue giving for. So you're seeing on the chart on the left here, kind of a steady drop off. There's a 8% drop from month 1 to month 2, and then smaller drops after that point, somewhere between 1% and 3%. By month 20, about half of monthly donors are still giving at that point. And then what you'll see over kind of a 1-year period, the chart you're looking at on the right, you're seeing the percentage of sustainers are still active over kind of a 1-year period. And while one-time donors saw big year-over-year retention changes, that monthly donor stat is pretty consistent even throughout the pandemic. Another kind of giving that's really important particularly for public media and cultural sectors is membership. So for public media nonprofits, we found that membership and individual giving were essentially interchangeable. So for participants in that sector, they reported 100% of online revenue as membership revenue, and that's a 5% decline year over year. For cultural organizations, we are seeing 64% of revenue coming from membership, and that saw a 9% increase in revenue last year and a 33% increase the year before that. So we're thinking that 33% increase and the continued increase is kind of in part likely being fueled by reopening of museums and other institutions after the shutdowns. For nonprofits with email programs that do both membership and other types of fundraising, we looked at kind of comparisons in email performance. And one of the big takeaways was a 6% times higher response rate for membership messages versus other types of fundraising messages. So kind of takeaways there could be the offer of tangible benefits or other things attached to membership emails. Also worth remembering that sometimes nonprofits will be sending memberships emails to a more targeted subset of their audiences. So kind of main takeaways here for me. I really was surprised to see the big swing in one-time donor retention that changed year over year, particularly from 2020, tracking all the way to 2022. So in my mind, what's going on there is the treatment that organizations make for their donors really matters, but what inspired those donors to give in the first place also makes a huge difference. So those people who are pandemic donors who may have retained really well during the pandemic in 2020 are much harder to retain now many years later. The other takeaway here was the consistency of monthly donors during that same time period. So that same time period where there's big variation in one-time giving, monthly donors were really steady. So for groups struggling with low emergency donor retention, monthly giving could be part of the answer there. I'm going to jump into email and mobile messaging now as well. Over email, one of the big changes this year was that there was a 2% decline in email list size in 2022. And that was a change because we saw growth the 2 years before that. Over 2022, 9% of subscribers unsubscribed and another 8% became undeliverable from bouncing. It's really hard to see these numbers because I know we all put a lot of work into growing our lists and trying to reach as many people as possible. And there are a lot of folks doing a lot of work to grow those lists through advocacy campaigns, interactive quizzes, surveys, offline to online recruitment, and a lot of other tactics. And I know Will, just calling back what he was reporting on earlier, a lot of groups are kind of investing in paid list acquisition as well. That's a lot of a really important piece of the pie too. Onto email volume. So this is, how many, the average experience for the person on an email list. Nonprofits sent 60 emails per subscriber in 2022, and that's 15% higher than the year before. So groups are sending more email, and roughly half of those messages were fundraising appeals. As you can see broken out here, there are some really big differences between the sectors though. So disaster and international aid sent the most of any sector, And 57% or 57 of those emails that they sent were fundraising emails. Meanwhile, if you look at public media, they sent a lot more newsletters than any other sector. But yeah, I think back to the international groups. One thing that was really interesting here is they also sent more engagement messages than any other groups. So they're pairing high fundraising volume with more engagement and cultivation to make sure that people are engaging with those organizations more than just the fundraising appeals. Overall, email revenue is down 4%. That tracks exactly with what Will reported earlier for kind of overall online revenue being down. And similarly, we're seeing disaster and international aid groups raising a lot more over email, and wildlife and animal welfare groups also being up. Oops. Email revenue per 1,000 fundraising emails sent was $90. So that's for every single fundraising email landing in a single inbox, it was raising 9 cents on average. And that number was down 15% year over year and down for every single sector. Jumping into the individual messages or messaging rates that feed into that. Before jumping into any individual stats here, I did want to call out that for the first time in our study, we're not reporting on open rates. So they're using our theme here, they're 86th. So we've always had to take open rates with a little bit of a grain of salt. There are kind of various tracking methods used that aren't 100% reliable. But at the end of 2021, Apple rolled out a privacy change that basically like totally broke down consistency and tracking there. So we stopped reporting on it. It can still be useful for individual organizations, particularly if your organization can distinguish between human opens and machine opens. That is really throwing everything off. But for benchmarks, we're just not reporting on it anymore. So for this chart, you're seeing the number in parentheses represents the change year over year. And virtually every email metric was down year over year. So kind of the big call out metric that my eyes jump to whenever we do the report is response rate. For fundraising, the response rate was 0.09%, and that was down by 18% year over year. And then for advocacy, that response rate was 1.3%, and it was down 8%. So email way harder last year. Despite all that, email still makes up a huge part of online programs, making up 14% of online revenue for groups in the study, only down very slightly year over year. I'm going to look also at mobile subscribers. So this data was provided by our friends at Upland. So thank you for your help with that. This is a channel where nonprofits are really trying to expand their efforts. Still smaller than email. So for every 1,000 email subscribers, groups had 236 subscribers on their text messaging lists. And while email saw some declines, mobile list grew 11% over the year. Mobile lists also were receiving a lot less messaging than email lists. So on average, nonprofits with mobile programs sent about 21 messages per subscriber in the year, with advocacy being kind of the highest portion of that volume, where on email fundraising was the highest kind of messaging type. On the right, you can see the biggest change within those different message types. Electoral had by far the biggest growth, which makes sense when you move from a non-election year to an election year. I think probably for a lot of folks in the room, you may have experienced a lot more political text messages over the course of the year. But it's worth mentioning that the groups in our study, they're not candidates, they're not like political action committees or anything. These are nonprofits sending them. So that big increase still only boils down to 3.6 electoral messages from these groups. All right, so big takeaways for this. Overall, email was a lot harder this past year. Groups needed to send more messages to slightly fewer people to raise a little bit less money. But it's still a big part of these online programs, and it's not going anywhere. And then on the other side, we have text messaging, where there's a lot of room to grow, and groups are still growing those lists, and there's room to scale up in terms of messaging. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to my colleague, Sarah, who's on the screen over here.
Awesome. Thanks, Johnny. My name is Sarah Coughlin. I'm a media director coming at you from my home office in Chicago. And I'm going to talk you through some of our advertising results, which I am just super stoked about. Before jumping into this, I should say that ads data sort of breaks down into a couple of categories. There's the strategic choices that nonprofits make, how much to spend, what kind of ads to run, et cetera. And then there's the actual results, which is what happens when those ads end up in front of audiences. We're going to go through those one by one. Obviously, they're interconnected, but we're going to kind of start with the biggest decision you can make, which is just the size of your digital ads budget. Obviously, 0 is an option, but I don't think a particularly good one. But last year, what we found is that nonprofits reinvested 11 cents into digital ads for every dollar raised online. I'm gonna hit pause there and explain this. I think this is a metric that if you're newer to it can be a little bit tricky. To be clear, this is not a measure of return on investment. We're going to talk about that. There's some super interesting results. Rather, this is about the scale of your digital ads budgets relative to the size of the digital program as a whole. So a nonprofit that raises $1 million through online channels in 2022 would have spent around $110,000 on digital ads placements. I will say many organizations right now are starting to think already about your budgets for the next fiscal year, or if you're like a June, July, you are about to enter into a new fiscal year. This is the metric that I like always look at when thinking about just what is the overall scale of what you should be spending on ads. Now, there's some variation here depending on sector, but I do think it's really interesting to see that small nonprofits are in the same range as large nonprofits. We have seen in some of our earlier studies that small organizations don't just have less revenue to begin with, but they're also reinvesting it at a lower rate. We did not see that this year. The small and medium organizations are not holding back. They're sort of like putting as much back in as their large counterparts, which I think is really, really exciting. The ads investments are also growing overall. On average, ads budgets increased by 28%, which I think is just so striking, especially when you compare that to the fact that overall, as we were noting, this is kind of a tough year in terms of revenue. Cultural nonprofits were the only sector that reported a decline from 2021 digital ad spend. And then, holy moly, disaster and international aid. This one I think is just kind of nuts. These organizations increased digital ad spending by 89% over the previous year. I can only assume that this is coming from budgets that were boosted sort of around February through April of last year with emergency response efforts after the outbreak of the war in Ukraine. Something that I think is really notable about this increase for the disaster and international aid sector is if you remember a second ago when we were looking at what share of your revenue you reinvested in ads, the ratio of spending to revenue for this sector was 10 cents per dollar, basically the overall average. So what that means in short is that the growth in ad spending was keeping pace with the increase in revenue. And in fact, like I think you could make a good argument that there may have been room to even increase further and still see effective results. I think this is a really great thing to keep in mind if you're in a rapid response moment and it sort of seems like you're spending absolutely silly money on ads. Maybe you are, but if your revenue is growing at a similar rate, like if you're seeing spikes in your email responses or a sudden surge in traffic to your like direct web, you're probably wise to take advantage of that moment, even if it does feel like you're sort of moving into a whole separate category of digital ad spending than you've like ever done before. Like it's worth it. Okay. So now that we have a sense of the scale of these budgets, let's dig into how they were distributed. Now, the largest portion of ads budgets was devoted to direct fundraising, 56%. I think it's really striking that there is not a lot of variance based on size of organization. Like it's a difference of like 2%. Basically, everybody pulls a little more than half of the budget and just puts that right back into fundraising last year. It is outside of fundraising that things get really interesting, and we see nonprofits of different sizes expressing different priorities through spending. So for lead generation, this is the really big one, right? Large nonprofits are spending only 13% of the overall ads budget, whereas medium and small organizations are spending 23 and 22% respectively. That's how the overall budget is broken down. Now, if we slice this one more level further, you get to the percentage of that fundraising budget. So the 56%, how is that broken out by channel? So when we do that, this is where we get into some really fascinating divergences by ad size. We'll start with the thing that's the same, which is search. Everybody spends about a third of your money on search. We're going to talk about why in a second. Spoiler, it's because the return is really great. But past that, you really start seeing a lot of differences. And I will say, this is one of the data points that gave me the biggest pause when I first looked at this. I was shocked to see that larger nonprofits were investing more in Meta, while smaller nonprofits were prioritizing display. I think that is very surprising. Stereotypically, Facebook, I think, has liked to position itself as being like a sort of small advertisers' ideal platform. And that seems to be switching up in a really sharp way. I think part of the reason for this is probably that it has been a very tough couple of years for Meta. There are lots of factors here, right? There's the sort of like larger anxiety about Meta as an ads platform, and like as a terrible force in our democracy. But the other sort of like really technical thing that a lot of you are probably aware of is that a couple of years ago, tracking users on mobile devices, specifically iPhones, got a lot harder on Meta. We know that 75 to 90% of iPhone users have opted out of app tracking. And that means that Meta has much less information available in terms of ad optimizations. And that has consequences for performance. What I think is really interesting here is that this would suggest to me that small nonprofits may be feeling these challenges more strongly than the larger ones. Think of it like if you have less data to optimize off of to begin with, and then that amount of data cuts by like 90%, then you just have so much less to work with. So that may be why smaller organizations are moving into display, just because the effect on Meta is so much worse for them. Last thing, in terms of the breakout on budget by channel, we've got some smaller channels noted here. Twitter and TikTok were not significant channels for fundraising, but we did see that large nonprofits specifically put $5 of every 100 into video. So it's a small channel, but it is one that they're investing on. But really striking that investment is really only happening for large and then to a lesser extent, medium organizations. Small organizations did not really have a presence on video. I think this is really just a factor of the fact that larger budgets can open up possibilities in channels that are emerging or where there's an uncertain return, or in the case of video, a high cost of entry. Like it just takes time and resources to develop video creative in a way that's different from a search ad where you can just kind of like type it up and you're ready to go. So as nonprofits continue to seek new audiences, I do think it's possible that we'll see more investment on Twitter, TikTok, and video. But video, I think, is going to be an especially interesting one because, again, of the sort of barrier to entry. Okay, let's talk about ROAS. So this is sort of our baseline metric of fundraising ads performance, return on ad spend. It's just for every dollar that you spent, how much did you get back? And I think it's really clear looking at this why nonprofits consistently spent a third of all budgets on search. It has the highest ROAS of any channel. And that makes sense, right? Most of the time when we're talking about search ads, you're bidding on people who are searching for your brand name. And so if someone goes into the search bar and plunks in donate to nonprofit, that is the single best person you can spend money on. And so it makes sense that the returns from those folks are really great. That being said, search is limited. You can only serve as many search ads as there are searches. You are pulling people in, but you cannot create new inventory. So that's why you sort of, I think, see things tapping out at a certain level. If I could spend 100% of my budget on search for a 275 ROAS, I would, but I can't. After that, Meta has the next highest ROAS overall, but massive variance between sectors. So hunger and poverty nonprofits have a return of $1.07 for every dollar spent. That's awesome. For rights organizations, on the other hand, the ROAS is 17 cents. Very, very bad. I think this again gets back to that point about the challenges on Meta, but I want to sort of contextualize this further and say that when a platform like this gets more difficult to use, it's not just that the returns get worse overall. It can also be that you get more variance, that it's a more difficult landscape. And so organizations are forced to be more experimental in their tactics and targeting. And that just leads to a lot of variance. So something like the decisions you're making about your audiences, what kind of creative you have available, just the range of possibilities really explodes. And that's why you end up with those big gaps between sectors. Incidentally, I do think Meta is giving us a little bit of a taste here of what we can expect down the line on some other channels. Display and video are two channels that are going to get hit very hard in about 18 months by the deprecation of third-party cookies. When that happens, we're going to see a similar thing of targeting and measurement are going to get a lot harder because of privacy-centric changes. And I think that may very well result in similarly a lot more variance in results between the organizations that have the ability to test and ones that don't. So keep an eye on that trend. Okay, going to shift over to lead generation. Again, this is a place where the investment between organizations of different sizes is quite variable, but really, really important for your email programs. There is a lot of variation here. But that said, even with the organizations that are paying the most per lead, still, I think there's a point to be made here that, you know, if you're effectively converting these folks to donors, that can still pay off over time. And that's probably why all organizations seem to be spending so much on this. For the first time, we are breaking out our lead gen results by channel. You can see that Meta is the one where we have the most consistent results. It is, I would say, a core channel for lead generation for most nonprofits. And once again, we see that little bit of variance. I think the variance is not quite as great within Meta for lead gen as for fundraising, but you still see the same kind of squeeze happening. Also of note here, large nonprofits reported more favorable results across many ads metrics, but that is actually not true here. This is the one place where both medium and small organizations actually had lower CPLs than large ones. Kind of funky. I also want to note on lead gen that we do have some results here from TikTok and YouTube. Those costs are higher, and you'll also notice a lot of gaps in the chart. That's because we only report, like Will said earlier, if there is sufficient volume from organizations. So very few organizations spent money on TikTok, and so that's why we don't have it broken down by sector. The costs are high, right? And I think some of that may reflect the relative immaturity of the platforms, the challenges of optimizing content, stuff like that. That said, I do want to put in a good word for experimenting with this. First off, just because experimenting early, right, can give you an edge later on. You're just learning more things. But also, it could be that it's worth paying a premium for leads that represent a younger, more diverse, or otherwise distinct audience than the ones who you've been getting historically from other sources. So something to think about. Okay. We are almost done. There's so much ads data, and I would literally talk about it for an hour and a half if Will would let me. But there's one really exciting thing that I want to talk to you about, which is Google Grants. This is a question that we have gotten so frequently in previous years, and we are thrilled to be able to include it this year. Quick sort of methodological note. I'm going to talk about these as return on dollars spent and cost per donation, but remember, Google Grant is a program where Google gives ad credits to participating nonprofits. That means that we are not talking about actual money, we are talking about monopoly money. So like when I say the return on ad spend is 7 cents, means that you spent, giant air quotes, however, like $1 in ad credits, but then you got back 7 cents in revenue. Now, that being said, the ROAS is a lot higher or a lot lower, and the cost per donation is a lot higher than paid ads. So Google Grants, for every $1 of money that you spend, you're raising 7 cents. Compare that back to paid search, where for every $1 that you spend, you're bringing in $2.75. That is a gap. That is a really significant gap. I do think sometimes like you can sort of think about this as like, well, it's free money. It's fine if the free money isn't super efficient. Yes, but I think it can also be helpful to think about this in terms of net revenue. So even though you didn't pay anything to get that 7 cents, it's only 7 cents. Contrast that with a paid search account where even after you subtract the original cost of the ads, you're still netting out $1.75. That's big, that's meaningful. I do think a lot of the reason here is just about the way that Google has set up the grant program. There are a lot of limits on it that make it harder to optimize. One of the big ones is that grant ads always appear below paid ads, and higher placement is generally better. So if you think back, for example, to last March when a lot of folks were Googling, how do I help people in Ukraine? If you have one organization that's using the grant to bid on those terms and another organization that's using a paid account, the paid account's ads are always going to show up first. That gives them an advantage, right? Speculating a bit, I also suspect that these results may reflect a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy. So nonprofits know that paid accounts are set up at an advantage. Therefore, they move their highest value campaigns into those paid accounts. Can't say that for certain, but certainly that's something that occurred to me when looking at this data. Okay, that being said, I don't want to say too many bad things about Grant. It is free money and you should spend it. And in particular, I think this is a really good way to drive site traffic, which can be super valuable. So for every $1,000 in grant credits, nonprofits generated 431 site visits. Those site visits, like, you should put them to work, right? That can generate email signups, petition signatures, volunteer recruitment. I also think this is worth considering if you have parts of your organization that are just harder to highlight. And so this is an easy thing that you can sort of like put the ad credits to work, highlighting that part of your work. So this is something to think about. Okay, and that's really it for ads. You don't need to read through all of this, but I do encourage you to read through the full ads results. There's so much that we didn't even have time to get into. But yeah, with that, I'm going to go ahead and pass it off to my colleague Ferenz to talk about social media.
All right, thanks, Sarah. So my name is Ferenz Kasoris. I'm a social media account supervisor at MNR. And my favorite breakfast food is, I'd say day-to-day a smoothie, but I will say if it's the weekend, then definitely banana walnut pancakes. All right, so we can dive into some social media metrics. So what we found is that almost all nonprofits in the study are on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, and most were on LinkedIn and YouTube, but a little under a third were on TikTok. And just as a reminder for everyone for this section, so this covers all of 2022. So the results of Elon Musk buying Twitter, which happened actually late last year, isn't really captured in the data we reported on. So this means that any migration to new platforms won't be reflected either.
Get ready for exciting results next year.
All right, so it's not really a surprise that nonprofits had their largest social media following on Facebook. So for every 1,000 email subscribers, groups had 685 Facebook fans, 160 Instagram followers, and 208 Twitter followers, and then 4 TikTok followers. So although those relative sizes did vary widely between sectors. So for example, for rights nonprofits, they reported twice as many Twitter followers as email subscribers, and then wildlife animal welfare groups had more Facebook followers than email subscribers. All right. So although Instagram audiences were smaller than Facebook or Twitter, they grew at the fastest rate, actually at 10%. Compared to Facebook fans, which increased just 4%, and then Twitter audience growth was actually flat year over year. So TBD if that was a good investment by Elon. All right, so but growing audiences is just the start. So the goal really of social media is obviously to serve content and to drive engagement. So we found that Instagram posts had a higher reach relative to nonprofits' follower account compared to Facebook and Twitter. So kind of breaking that down a bit, Instagram posts had an average of 65 for every 1,000 followers that a nonprofit had. So that translates to if a nonprofit had 500,000 Instagram fans, then that post would be seen by 32,500 users on average. And then comparing that to Facebook, so if that post went live on Facebook and if they had the same number of followers, that post would be seen by just 26,500 users. And then as a reminder, so reach is determined by a variety of factors. So this includes the size of the nonprofit's follower base, the type of content. So for example, stories had a much lower reach than feed posts. And then also the algorithm of each platform, which everyone knows is changing seemingly day to day. And then finally, user engagement. All right, so nonprofits posted most frequently on Twitter with 1.6 posts per day. And then on Facebook, it was about once per day. And then on Instagram, it was 0.8 posts per day. And then as with a lot of these metrics, TikTok is still trailing far behind. So TikTok came in with 0.1 posts per day for nonprofits. And then just breaking it down a bit. So public media groups posted the most with 3.7 Facebook posts per day and 5.1 tweets per day. And then for wildlife and animal welfare groups, they had 0.3 TikToks per day, which was the highest among all the groups, but still below the other platforms. All right. And then so Facebook posts for wildlife animal groups were also more likely to be photos at 56%, which is actually more than twice the overall average of 24%. And then in comparison, public media nonprofits heavily emphasize links instead, with 90% of their posts being links. All right. So overall, 1.1% of online revenue came from Facebook. And this isn't just from Facebook fundraisers, but actually the vast majority of this revenue is from user-generated Facebook fundraisers. And it wasn't just the share of online revenue from Facebook that declined from 2021 levels. It went from 1.4% to 1.1%, but the absolute amount raised was also lower for most nonprofit types. There was one exception, which was the disaster international aid sector, where Facebook revenue about doubled from the previous year. So the performance of Facebook fundraisers was pretty consistent across sectors, with a median fundraiser effort generating 4 donations. But some users were able to drive more donations. So to note, the colored bars in the charts show the range from the 25th to the 75th percentile. The average gift made to Facebook fundraisers was $34. And these results are consistent with what we've been reporting in every benchmark that has included Facebook fundraisers. And the results of each individual fundraiser campaign tended to be fairly modest, coming in at about 4 gifts and $30 each. So the biggest difference and the biggest kind of place where groups can have an impact here is the number of people who start fundraisers and ask the people who care about them to donate to an organization. All right, so something new we actually have to share this year is influencer data. So we surveyed participants about their influencer strategies and results. And almost half of nonprofits who answered our questions about social media influencers said that they worked with influencers in 2022. But out of those organizations, just 13% paid those influencers to post. And then kind of diving a little deeper, among the 13%, the average number of paid influencer partnerships was 6 over the course of the year, with about 10 posts for those influencers. And then just finally about influencers, the most common use for partnerships was content creation around narrative, persuasion, and culture change. All right, just to recap some of the key social media takeaways, nonprofits are diversifying their social media presences. So we saw that Instagram audiences increased the most for nonprofits, with a 10% change in followers. TikTok is the latest platform that appears to be getting traction, but it's still pretty small, with only about 30% of nonprofits using the platform as of 2022. And then also, even with large audiences, reach can be a challenge. So this is especially true, as I mentioned, with kind of the constant algorithm changes and kind of the different types of content that platforms decide to prioritize. So this is why other tools like paid promotion and influencer partnerships are important ways to expand that reach and really kind of engage your audience. And then finally about fundraisers. So Facebook fundraisers bring in a small amount of revenue, and this revenue actually declined again in 2022. So the most important thing is expanding the total number of supporters starting fundraisers. And I'll hand it over to Teresa.
Hi, great. Make sure this is. Advancing.
It's hard today. It is.
Oh, great. Hi, I'm Teresa Bujo. I'm the Director of Data Analytics at M&R, and I always love working on benchmarks. And I'm going to talk to you about website performance. So first off, when we're talking about website performance, it helps to know where visitors are coming from and how they're experiencing the site. So that lets you draw attention to site elements that you want to prioritize. So overall, 38% of nonprofit website visitors arrived to the site via organic search results. So organic here means that the user entered a search term and clicked on a result that was not a paid ad. For some sectors like cultural and public media nonprofits, that's almost half of their traffic. For cultural nonprofits, it could be, because users can search for specific relevant terms. So let's say you Google the name of your local museum, there's a good chance that the top results will lead you right there. Public media groups might also be seeing this for users who search for their local station's call sign. But they also get visits through things like reporting and news updates and performances and other content. So they, both those types of sectors often see higher percentage of organic visitors. But that only touches on what drives organic traffic, and it shows how much the relationships between visitors and nonprofits can vary. There's a big difference between somebody searching for a local public media station because they, heard a pledge drive on the morning commute, they looked for that station and then they made a gift, versus someone who read a news article and made it to the site for that reason. So overall, for organic visitors, just 0.44% of organic visitors make a donation. And that's just 77 cents per organic visitor. So we're talking about a very low percentage who actually end up converting. So let's talk a little bit more about that donation conversion. Once visitors do make it to a website's main donation page, only 19% of them complete a gift. So given that large volume of traffic and this low percentage of visitors who donate, there is a lot of potential here to increase revenue by improving conversion rate. Now, some of that work is done by optimizing the site overall, figuring out how you encourage visitors to get to a donation page and how you convince them to make a gift in the end. But some of that also happens on the donation page itself. So this is where it's really important to continually test, make sure that you're testing things like images, copy, case for giving, user flow, and lots of other elements on the main donation page. Here's something you could potentially test as well. This is a new metric this year. We do have a lot of new metrics in the report this year that I'm very excited about. This is one of the fun ones. So we asked participants which payment platforms they accept beyond standard credit card options. The most popular alternative was PayPal, with 74% of participants accepting payments through PayPal. Other tools like Apple Pay, Google, and Venmo are not as popular yet, but I'm sure we'll be seeing those grow over time. Many of these tools are really made to help transactions easier, make transactions easier for folks on mobile devices. So this really should be an urgent priority for nonprofits to make sure they're thinking about these ways to make donations easier. And let me show you why that's so important. It's because 57% of nonprofit website traffic comes from users on mobile devices and tablets. But those visits amount to just 36% of donation transactions and only 25% of website revenue. That means that mobile users are not only less likely to give than desktop users, they also have a lower average gift. And that means that we need to be working on that. So some big takeaways on website performance. Organic traffic makes up a large portion of nonprofit website traffic, but very few people from that traffic make a gift. It doesn't mean that their engagement isn't important. There are lots of important reasons to be going to nonprofit sites that aren't just making donations, particularly within some sectors. People are going to sites for vital information, but it's still something to be thinking about. Most nonprofit website traffic comes from users on mobile devices, but most transactions and revenue come from desktop users. So if nonprofits can find ways to increase conversion rate among particularly organic users and folks on mobile devices, there's just a lot of potential there. That means optimizing donation pages, making sure to look at results by device when you're evaluating tests, and adding payment options like PayPal or other options to make it as easy as possible to donate. With that, that was the end of the charts, folks. With that, I'm going to turn it back to Madeline.
It's not the end of the data. This is just a portion of what's in the book and on the website. And I hope you explore all of it, especially all the puns. I'm just going to tell you the glossary is my favorite part. And please, I won't ruin it for you, but please read every word. You will not be disappointed. We do want to move into question and answer. I want to say Will and Teresa and Johnny have been answering questions in real time while they're sitting here for folks online. But I imagine folks here in the room also have some questions that you might want to ask. Or you don't. Oh, we have mics for people. Yeah, in the front row. Could you say your name and what organization you're from? Keegan Goodis from Trilogy. I'll repeat it. Yeah.
You can just really. I find it really interesting that these smaller nonprofits are spending so much in display and yet are getting such a low ROAS. So I was just curious if you see anything qualitatively, at least on why that is.
Sarah, did you hear the question?
I sure did. I think one of the reasons for it is that if you're a small organization, you have a higher hill to climb by spending on display. Like display is primarily manifesting in like sending people to your website, right? Boosting any kind of organic traffic. And so if you have a smaller profile, evidenced by smaller revenue, then you just have to do more to fight against that. So if anything, I think this is probably small organizations recognizing that they just need to take a big swing and doing it anyway. The only other thing that I would say on display is I know there have been a lot of questions in the chat about view-through attribution. So I'll just share one quick other thing, which is that, so for the study, we asked participants to include 100% of both view and click revenue. We do have a comparison though of year over year, how much of advertising revenue came from view-through conversions. So year over year, we actually saw that there was less view-through revenue than the prior year that was reported. I do not think this is actually because display and video ads have gotten less effective. I think it's because they've gotten harder to measure because there are already multiple really commonly used browsers that either don't use or short circuit the cookie tracking that enables us to measure the impact of that. So I think there's probably something also there of these smaller organizations saying, even if we're investing on display and we don't have directly attributable results, we can look at, for example, the boost to our email program or direct web revenue year over year and make sort of a guess about the impact that it's having.
Right on. Thanks, Keegan. Other questions? Yeah, right up here. If you can say your name and org first.
Hi, my name is Kelly Shimoleski. I'm a consultant with the Possibility Shop. I have a question overall and then specifically with this last section about social media and whether you have any correlations between like age and life stage and who's on which platform. So we look at these numbers and might draw a certain conclusion about which channel to use. But I'm curious if I'm a nonprofit and my core audience is a certain age or life stage, how do I account for that in kind of leveraging this information to make decisions?
That sounds like a question for Ferenc. I wonder if Ferenc wanted to answer that.
Yeah, in terms of audiences, so yeah, we didn't include any of that data kind of in benchmarks, but we do know for kind of social media platforms, definitely kind of different age groups tend to use certain platforms. So for example, if you're trying to reach Gen Z, you do not want to be focusing on Facebook. You want to be focused on like TikTok. So yeah, it's really kind of important to kind of keep your audience in mind and then kind of activating on the platform that audience is mainly active on.
I was just on a call with a client before this webinar in which they were saying, how do we justify investing in TikTok? How do we justify that? And it's sort of like, well, first of all, like with a funder, do we have to justify this? It's a TikTok. We have to be on there, but it's hard to justify it in terms of results yet, but it's impossible for us to say that we shouldn't be on there at some point for reaching new audiences. So it's a hard one. Anybody wanted to add to that from our our panelists? I feel like it's a panel of experts over here.
No,
I don't know the answers to any questions. so-
I think the one thing to add to that, there's a question also of somebody asking about mobile stats and those differences between mobile and desktop results, also perhaps being age related. That's a level of data we just don't have access to for benchmarks, but I think it's definitely worth thinking about, and probably those demographic differences are part of what's behind those differences. We can't control that. We can control what we're optimizing on our websites, how we're talking to folks, where we are showing up. Those are the things that we can do. And so when you know kind of like, yes, this is part of the demographic difference, these are the audiences we want to be reaching, you need to layer that on top of the data that we actually have.
Thank you. There was a question over here that someone had, Brittany.
Perhaps a basic question, and I think I'm getting an idea looking at your participant list, but just curious how you distinguish between the individuals that you included in your kind of cultural customers versus your rights customers, because I can imagine there's some tricky overlap there. So just curious there.
Yeah, so so participants self-select. So we ask them which sector they are in, and so definitely there are lots of overlaps between different categories. An organization might feel right at home within the hunger and poverty section, but also feel right at home with rights because their missions overlap those. We ask them to self-select. So if you look in the back of the study or on the website, there's a list of every single participant and which sector they selected into.
Do we ever argue with them? No.
Yes.
Yeah. I think only in the cases where their sector might not be represented enough to actually have a sample, we might say like, maybe you want to be in the international aid or sector. And so we won't argue with them like and override them, but yeah, we have gone back to groups and asked them to join it.
Other questions? In the back, Beth Rader.
Hi, Beth Rader, self-employed but proud former Evinar staffer. When it comes to deliverability problems on the email side, I wonder if you saw any trends, maybe it's not in benchmarks, but any trends with clients. And then also, obviously, things like Google verified sender program wasn't on the nonprofit side, but did any of the like stuff on the political side impact nonprofits in a negative way in terms of how people can be reached?
Who wants to take that? Experts?
I think there's a lot about deliverability that we can't address directly in the study. We didn't compare like performance during the election period to other periods. I will say one of the things that we reported on was the decline in list size. And I think it's called out in the study. We don't report it on specifically, but I know that part of the decline in list size is from groups beginning to suppress inactive records as a response to getting into trouble with spam folders and wanting to get rid of those people. So I know email list sizes have definitely taken a direct hit from deliverability issues for sure.
All right. Other questions? No other comments? Oh, okay. Go ahead. One more time. Can you get the microphone? Teresa, can you grab the microphone? Thank you. Right here.
Hi, Kelly Shimoletsky again. I'm a consultant with the Possibility Shop. I also have 17-year history with public media. And so I noticed in the list of participants, there are local and national organizations. Do you find that the results are kind of equally representative, whether it's a local organization or a national one responding?
Yeah, I think public media is one where we see like wide variation within the sector too, because they're smaller organizations and also because they're geographically focused. We see the same thing within the hunger poverty sector because we have, I think it's 35 food banks participating this year, which they of course have a regional focus. So yeah, I think like it really can depend, but I think the commonality is more within the sector than it is. I think like the sector impacts kind of override a lot of the variation. I think the biggest thing is size of organization, kind of what makes that vary.
Right on. Other questions? Comments? Compliments?
My compliments to the staff.
Excellent. Thank you.
We had one question on the chat earlier that I wanted to answer live.
Yeah, so I'll ask the question. I think, Sarah, you're probably the one to answer it. The question is, do we have an idea of whether ads budgets increase because ads work so well or because it's taking a bigger investment to get returns on investment? Given that it's harder to target on Facebook.
Oh, I think it's definitely both. Definitely both. And I think I would actually refer back to the sector, just overall fundraising results as a really interesting example here, that if you are a disaster relief organization, then last year was big boom times for you. And so you spent a lot more money. But I think there are also sectors that we saw that had lower revenue year over year and still spent more on ads. And that to me is just an indicator that a lot of organizations are seeing ads as the growth opportunity, sort of whatever your problem is, you can find an ad solution to it. Yeah, that's my guess, but it's a guess.
Right on. Any other questions that you wanted to raise up from the chat?
Yeah, there was one from Jessica Getty who asked, do you anticipate Bing search being more important because of their embrace of OpenAI and ChatGPT? I want to hear, I want to say something and then I want to see if Sarah agrees because that's how I know if I'm right. So my feeling is that I mean, I think it's really hard for people to change their habits once they've embraced the platform. It's really hard to move off from it. So it's just like it's hard for many of us to actually stop using Twitter. I think it's going to be hard for folks to stop Googling and start Binging, even if they're in a quick way. So we'll see if people actually want to migrate the way they do search, but I'm skeptical that it's going to be a very big change.
Sarah?
Yeah, I think there's actually an interesting analog to Twitter, right? That like everybody talks a lot about Twitter because Twitter is full of journalists who like to talk about being on Twitter, but it's not actually the largest ad platform by any stretch. I think there's probably, or social media platform, I think there's maybe a similar thing with Bing, that the people who are super stoked about Bing AI are not necessarily representative as well. It's like, you know, sort of like techie people who are interested in that thing. Yeah, I think Bing has, to me, the reasons why Bing has a lower market share just like have a lot more to do, like Will was saying, with people's habits. I do wonder though, Madeline, if this might be a good chance to also talk about a question that I think like 3 different people have asked in the chat, which
Let's do
is
it.
what is the impact of generative AI on search? I think this is a really rich question. The short answer is like, search is going to stay important because that is the way that people find things on the internet. And if the thing that they're trying to find is a nonprofit to donate to, then this is always going to be the center of our ads programs. But the way that people interact with the platform is changing. I always think about this, like if you watch like TV shows from the 2000s and you see someone Googling, like the actual words that they input into Google are very different from like what you or I would do today. I think 10 years from now, like the actual way that we interact with these platforms is going to change. And so the companies that run them are going to need to change their ads algorithms in order to serve people the most relevant content. Google has always set up their platform in a way that is like based on what they think the best user experience is. And so if user behavior changes, then their method for evaluating ads certainly will. We will have to see what that actually looks like. My guess is that the answer is going to be AI. Like Google has been really pushing broad match, for example. But I do think it is probably helpful to keep in mind that all of these companies like are fundamentally self-interested, and it is highly unlikely to me that Google is going, or Bing is going to like land on a way of doing search that doesn't give them an opportunity to monetize it. Like ads are still going to be a really critical part of the platform, just in some, you know, whatever form.
Right on. Question. And do you want to say your name and organization?
Sure, Patrick Kidda, IFA. My guess is that there will be a lot more predictive aspects of search through AI, as well as instead of asking, telling.
Sarah, did you agree? Yeah, Sarah's nodding.
Yeah, definitely.
You're right.
That's true. Not wrong there. Other questions? Well, the good news is that the panelists and I won't be able to answer any questions, but I'll try to be amusing. But they can answer your questions. I will say, I just want to say a couple things before we move. Wait, any last questions? Going, gone. We all good on the chat as well? Thank you for all the rich questions on the chat. The group of people that put together benchmarks, most of us have been doing this together. We realized last night at dinner for 10 years. And so there's a reason why it's really exciting, right? In our industry that changes fast. It makes me really proud that Johnny, Will, Teresa, and myself, and Laura is not quite 10 years, but she's getting there. And then Melissa Hines is our newest member. But we've been doing it for a long time and we take a lot of pride in it. And we know that a lot of you have been doing it for equally long, if not longer. We would not be able to do this without the participation of the nonprofits that are here in this room and online. And we're just so grateful to that, to all of you for the work that you do to make this happen. Folks online, you can say goodbye because you're going to miss the party with pies, bubbles, and bars, pies, bars, and bubbles. Yes, that's right. We have pies, bars, and bubbles in the next room. Please stick around for the delicious food. Laura Clavon is our brand manager here at M&R, and she puts this all together, and she hides Easter eggs everywhere you go in the food and the drink and all that jazz. We also have a couple things. One is there's, a photo wall for you to take a picture, and it wouldn't kill you to take a picture wearing a chef hat and an apron. And we also have party favors in the form of your 3 favorite vegetables according to Benchmarks participants, which are potatoes, broccolis, and onions. So please feel free to take a potato, a broccoli, or an onion. I said at the beginning, take 1 book for you and your organization. We're trying not to kill too many trees here, so please do that. But I understand if you want more, because it is a gorgeous book this year. So yeah, right on. Carry on. Laura's going to turn the music on and the party begins. Thanks a lot. All right.
Nice to meet you, Rafael.